What you are about to hear is a work of fiction. The people, places, and events depicted in this story are products of the author's imagination or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual individuals, living or deceased, or to real situations is purely coincidental. These stories may explore themes of crime, injustice, and human suffering. While fictional, they reflect real emotions and difficult truths that some may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised.
I trusted you with everything, and you stole from the people who needed it most. The words hung in the air like thunder, charged with betrayal and righteous anger. But to understand how Ruth Patterson, a gentle 69-year-old retired teacher, came to utter those words with such fierce conviction, we need to go back to where it all began. Please let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know just how far our stories reach. 3 months earlier, Ruth had been living a quiet life in her small 2-bedroom house on Maple Street. The walls were lined with photos of her late husband George and their grown children, now scattered across the country with families of their own. The silence that had once felt overwhelming after George's passing 2 years ago had gradually become a peaceful companion, but Ruth knew she needed more than solitude to fill her days. That's when she discovered Helping Hands, a local charity that provided food assistance and emergency aid to struggling families in their community. The small storefront operation was located just 6 blocks from Ruth's home, nestled between a hardware store and a coffee shop that had seen better days. "We could really use someone with your organizational skills," Amanda Collins had said during Ruth's first visit. Amanda was the charity's coordinator, a polished woman in her mid-40s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a warm smile that seemed to light up the cramped office space. "I've been running this place almost single-handedly for 3 years now, and we're finally getting the recognition we deserve." Ruth had been immediately impressed by Amanda's apparent dedication. The walls were covered with thank you letters from grateful families, newspaper clippings about the charity's good work, and photos of Amanda presenting oversized checks to various community causes. Amanda wore her commitment like a badge of honor, often mentioning how she worked for barely minimum wage because she believed so strongly in their mission. "I don't do this for the money," Amanda would often say, gesturing around the modest office. "These families need us, and that's what matters." Ruth threw herself into the volunteer work with the enthusiasm of someone who had found her calling again. She arrived every Tuesday and Thursday morning at 8 sharp, ready to help sort donations, pack food boxes, and assist families who came seeking help. The work reminded her of her teaching days, the satisfaction of helping others, the sense of being needed and useful. For the first month, everything seemed perfect. Ruth worked alongside 2 other regular volunteers, Janet, a retired nurse in her 70s, and Kevin, a college student who came in on weekends. Amanda managed the intake interviews with families, handled the financial aspects, and coordinated with local businesses for donations. But small things began to bother Ruth, little inconsistencies that her teacher's mind couldn't ignore. During her 2nd month of volunteering, she noticed that the number of food boxes they packed never seemed to match the number of families Amanda claimed they were serving. "We helped 43 families last week," Amanda announced during one of their brief volunteer meetings. But Ruth had distinctly remembered packing only 31 boxes, and she had been there both days they distributed food. When Ruth gently mentioned the discrepancy, Amanda's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Oh, Ruth, you must have missed the emergency boxes I prepared after you left. I often stay late to handle urgent cases." Ruth accepted the explanation, though something nagged at her. She began paying closer attention, mentally tracking the boxes she helped prepare and the families she saw receiving assistance. The numbers consistently didn't add up. Then there was the matter of the grocery store donations. Ruth had been present when Mr. Henderson from Brookside Market delivered what appeared to be several $100s worth of canned goods and fresh produce. But when she arrived the next morning, she found only a fraction of those items in their storage area. What happened to the rest of the donation from Brookside Market? Ruth asked Amanda directly. Amanda barely looked up from her computer. "Oh, we had an emergency request from the Johnson family. You know, the single mother with 3 kids. I had to take most of it directly to her house last night." The explanation was plausible, even admirable, but Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She began to notice other small details. Amanda's increasingly expensive-looking clothes and jewelry, her new smartphone, the lease payments she occasionally mentioned for what sounded like a luxury car. During her 3rd month at Helping Hands, Ruth's concerns deepened when she encountered Mrs. Rodriguez, a soft-spoken woman in her 50s who had been coming to the charity for several weeks seeking assistance with rent money. "I keep filling out the applications," Mrs. Rodriguez confided to Ruth in broken English. "But Miss Amanda, she always says maybe next week. My landlord, he is getting very angry." Ruth was puzzled. She had seen Mrs. Rodriguez's paperwork herself. The woman clearly qualified for emergency assistance, and Ruth knew they had funds specifically designated for rent help. She had seen the ledger where Amanda tracked such distributions. That afternoon, Ruth decided to check the records herself. Amanda kept meticulous files in a series of cabinets behind her desk, and Ruth had often helped file paperwork there. She waited until Amanda stepped out for lunch, then quietly reviewed Mrs. Rodriguez's file. According to the records, Mrs. Rodriguez had been approved for $400 in emergency rent assistance 2 weeks ago. The paperwork showed Amanda's signature authorizing the payment, and there was even a copy of what appeared to be a check made out to Mrs. Rodriguez's landlord. Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she closed the file. If the payment had been approved and supposedly sent, why was Mrs. Rodriguez still desperately seeking help? And why had Amanda told the woman to keep waiting? Over the following weeks, Ruth began to notice a disturbing pattern. She would encounter families around town who mentioned their gratitude for Helping Hands assistance, but their descriptions of what they had received never quite matched what Ruth remembered packing or what the records indicated had been distributed. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning in late October. Ruth arrived early, as was her custom, and found Amanda's office door slightly ajar. She could hear Amanda on the phone, her voice carrying the professional tone she used with donors and community leaders. "Yes, we distributed over $2,000 in emergency assistance last month alone," Amanda was saying. "The need in our community is tremendous, but thanks to generous donors like yourself, we're making a real difference." Ruth knew with absolute certainty that they had distributed nowhere near $2,000 in emergency assistance the previous month. She had been present for every distribution, had helped prepare every check, had seen every family who received aid. The actual amount couldn't have been more than $600. As Amanda continued her conversation, boasting about their impact and soliciting additional donations, Ruth felt a cold realization settle in her stomach. Amanda wasn't just exaggerating their accomplishments, she was lying outright about where the money was going. That evening, Ruth sat in her living room staring at the phone. She needed to talk to someone, but who? Her children lived far away and barely understood her volunteer work. Her few close friends might think she was imagining things or being overly suspicious. Finally, she dialed a familiar number. "Frank? It's Ruth. I know it's late, but I need to talk to you." Frank Patterson, Ruth's younger brother by 3 years, had retired from the police force 5 years earlier after a distinguished 30-year career. He lived across town with his wife Carol, and while he and Ruth had a loving relationship, it was sometimes strained by Frank's tendency to be overprotective since George's death. "What's wrong, Ruthie?" Frank's voice immediately shifted to concern. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, but I think something terrible is happening at the charity where I volunteer." 20 minutes later, Frank was sitting in Ruth's kitchen, listening intently as she laid out her suspicions. His weathered face grew increasingly serious as she described the discrepancies in donations, the families who weren't receiving promised aid, and Amanda's increasingly elaborate lifestyle. "Ruth, these are serious accusations," Frank said carefully. Embezzlement, fraud. If you're right, this woman could be facing prison time. I know how it sounds, Ruth replied, her voice steady despite her nervousness. But Frank, I've been a teacher for 35 years. I know when someone is lying to me. I know when numbers don't add up. And I know when children are going hungry because someone is stealing from them. Frank leaned back in his chair, processing everything his sister had told him. Okay, let's say you're right. What do you want to do about it? I want to stop her, Ruth said without hesitation. But I need help. If I confront her directly, she'll just deny everything and probably find a way to get rid of me. You know how these things work better than I do. Frank nodded slowly. We'll need evidence. Real evidence, not just suspicions and inconsistencies. Financial records, documentation of where the money is really going, proof that she's been lying to donors and cheating families. How do we get that? Carefully, Frank said. And legally. The last thing we want is for her to get off on a technicality because we did something wrong. Over the next 2 weeks, Ruth and Frank developed a careful plan. Ruth would continue volunteering as normal, but she would start documenting everything she observed. Frank, meanwhile, would use his contacts in the police department and the district attorney's office to understand what kind of evidence would be needed to build a case. Ruth began keeping a detailed journal of her observations at Helping Hands. She noted every family that came seeking help, every donation that arrived, every food box that was packed and distributed. She started taking discreet photos of paperwork with her phone, always careful to ensure Amanda wasn't watching. The more evidence Ruth gathered, the clearer the scope of Amanda's deception became. Checks that were supposedly written to families were actually being deposited into accounts Amanda controlled. Donations from businesses were being partially diverted before they ever reached the charity's official records. Even some of the thank you letters on Amanda's wall appeared to be fabricated. Ruth had never seen some of the families mentioned. But gathering evidence proved more difficult than Ruth had anticipated. Amanda seemed to sense that something had changed, and she began watching Ruth more closely. She started keeping her office door locked when she wasn't present, and she began handling more of the financial paperwork herself rather than asking Ruth to help with filing. I think she suspects something, Ruth told Frank during one of their evening strategy sessions. She's been acting differently around me, asking more questions about why I'm staying late or what I'm working on. We need to be more careful, Frank agreed. But we're close, Ruth. I've been talking to Detective Morrison. You remember her, Sandra Morrison? She handled that case with the city contractor a few years back. She's interested in what we've found so far, but she needs more concrete evidence before she can open an official investigation. The breakthrough came in mid-November, during the charity's annual Thanksgiving drive. Local businesses and individuals had donated generously, and the office was filled with boxes of food, envelopes of cash donations, and checks from community supporters. Ruth was helping sort donations when Amanda stepped out to meet with a reporter from the local newspaper who was doing a story about the charity's Thanksgiving efforts. In her haste, Amanda had left her computer unlocked, something Ruth had never seen before. Ruth knew she had only a few minutes. Her heart pounding, she quickly accessed Amanda's email and financial records. What she found was worse than she had imagined. Amanda had been systematically skimming from donations for over 2 years. She had created false expense reports, fake vendor invoices, and even fictitious emergency assistance recipients. The total amount appeared to be well over $50,000, money that should have gone to feed hungry families and help people in crisis. Ruth quickly took photos of the most damning documents with her phone, her hands shaking with adrenaline and anger. As she heard Amanda's voice in the hallway, she hurriedly closed the computer programs and returned to sorting donations. "How are we doing in here?" Amanda asked as she returned, her media smile still in place. "Fine," Ruth managed, hoping her voice sounded normal. "Just getting these canned goods organized by type." But Amanda's eyes were sharp, and Ruth could tell she was studying her face. "You look flushed, Ruth. Are you feeling all right?" "Just a little warm from all the activity," Ruth replied. "Maybe I'll step outside for some fresh air." As Ruth walked home that afternoon, she felt the weight of what she had discovered. This wasn't just about money, it was about betrayal of the most vulnerable people in their community. Families who were struggling to feed their children, elderly people who needed help with medical bills, working parents who couldn't make ends meet, all of them had been betrayed by someone they trusted. That evening, Frank came over to review the photos Ruth had taken. His expression grew darker as he scrolled through the evidence on her phone. "This is it, Ruth. This is what we need. Sandra Morrison is going to want to see this right away." "What happens now?" Ruth asked. "Now we set a trap," Frank said grimly. "And we make sure Amanda Collins can't hurt any more families." Detective Morrison, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s with 20 years of experience investigating financial crimes, met with Ruth and Frank the following morning. She studied the evidence carefully, asking detailed questions about Ruth's observations and the charity's operations. "This is solid work," Detective Morrison finally said, "but to make charges stick, we need to catch her in the act. We need her to either admit to the theft or to document her actually stealing donations." Frank leaned forward. "What do you have in mind?" "The charity's Christmas drive is coming up, right? That's probably going to be their biggest fundraising event of the year. If Amanda is going to make a major move, that's when she'll do it." Ruth felt a chill of determination. "What do you need me to do?" Over the next 2 weeks, Ruth, Frank, and Detective Morrison carefully planned their operation. Ruth would continue volunteering normally, but she would wear a small recording device during the Christmas Drive event. Frank would be positioned nearby, ready to intervene if necessary, and Detective Morrison would have backup officers in unmarked cars around the charity. The Christmas Drive was scheduled for Saturday, the 15th of December. Local businesses had donated prizes for a raffle. Families were expected to come for free holiday meals, and the community response had been overwhelming. Ruth arrived early that morning, the tiny recording device hidden beneath her volunteer t-shirt. Amanda was in her element, greeting donors with enthusiastic hugs, posing for photos with oversized checks, and giving interviews to local media outlets. She wore a new designer dress that Ruth estimated must have cost more than most of the families they served spent on groceries in a month. "Isn't this wonderful, Ruth?" Amanda gushed as she swept past with another group of potential donors. "This is exactly why we do this work, to bring the community together and help those in need." Ruth smiled and nodded, but inside she felt sick. She watched as cash donations poured in, envelopes from individuals, collections from church groups, proceeds from school fundraisers. All of it was supposed to go directly to helping struggling families, but Ruth now knew that a significant portion would end up in Amanda's personal accounts. As the day progressed, Ruth documented everything she could. She helped Amanda count the cash donations, noting the amounts, and making sure her recording device captured Amanda's comments about how the money would be used. "We've raised almost $8,000 today," Amanda announced to the remaining volunteers as the event wound down. "This is going to help so many families have a better Christmas." But Ruth noticed that Amanda was already separating some of the cash donations into a separate envelope, money that wasn't being recorded in the official tally. As the other volunteers began cleaning up, Amanda asked Ruth to stay behind to help with final paperwork. Ruth's pulse quickened. This might be the moment they had been waiting for. "Ruth, I want to thank you for all your hard work these past few months," Amanda said, once they were alone in the office. "You've been such a valuable volunteer." "I'm glad I could help," Ruth replied, wondering where this conversation was leading. Amanda moved to her desk and pulled out the envelope of cash donations she had separated earlier. "You know, with all the success we've had lately, I've been thinking about expanding our operations. Maybe opening a second location across town." Ruth watched as Amanda began counting the money in the envelope, money that should have been included in the official donation total. The thing is, Amanda continued, expanding costs money, and sometimes we have to be creative about how we fund growth opportunities. Ruth's heart was pounding, but she kept her voice steady. What do you mean? Amanda looked up from the money with a smile that no longer seemed warm. Well, donors give money to help people, right? And if we can help more people by expanding our reach, then temporarily borrowing from donations to fund that expansion is really just an investment in our mission. Borrowing? Ruth asked, unable to keep the edge out of her voice. It's not stealing, Ruth. It's strategic resource allocation. The money will be paid back once the new location is generating its own donations. Ruth felt a surge of anger that she could no longer contain. Amanda, that money was donated specifically to help families at Christmas. Those donors trusted us to use their money exactly as we promised. Amanda's smile faded. Ruth, I think you're misunderstanding the complexity of running a charity. This isn't as simple as you think. No, I think I understand perfectly, Ruth said, her voice growing stronger. I think you've been stealing from this charity for years. I think you've been lying to donors, cheating families who need help, and getting rich off other people's generosity. Amanda's face went pale, then flushed with anger. That's a very serious accusation, Ruth, and a very foolish one for someone your age to be making. What's that supposed to mean? It means that if you start spreading lies about me, people are going to wonder about your mental state. They're going to remember that you're almost 70 years old, that you've been stressed since your husband died, that maybe you're not as sharp as you used to be. Ruth felt a chill at the threat in Amanda's voice, but she stood her ground. I know what I've seen, Amanda. I know about the fake invoices, the diverted donations, the families who never received the help you claimed to give them. Amanda stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You don't know anything, you meddling old woman. And if you're smart, you'll forget whatever you think you've figured out and go home to your empty house. I trusted you, Ruth said, her voice heavy with disappointment and betrayal. I believed in what we were doing here. I thought we were helping people. We are helping people, Amanda snapped. We're helping me build something bigger and better than this shabby little operation, and if some of the money gets redirected along the way, that's just the cost of progress. I trusted you with everything, Ruth said, her voice rising with emotion, and you stole from the people who needed it most. Amanda laughed, a cold sound that filled the small office. Prove it. Go ahead and try to prove it. Who's going to believe you over me? I'm the one with the community awards, the media coverage, the testimonials from grateful families. You're just a lonely old woman who volunteers to feel important. But Amanda's confidence began to crack when she saw Ruth's calm smile. Actually, Amanda, I think Detective Morrison will find my evidence quite compelling. Amanda's face went white. What detective? The office door opened, and Detective Morrison stepped in, followed by Frank and two uniformed officers. Amanda Collins, Detective Morrison said, showing her badge, you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and theft of charitable donations. As the officer read Amanda her rights, Ruth watched the woman who had seemed so confident and powerful just moments before crumble into tears and desperate denials. This is ridiculous, Amanda sobbed. She's a confused old woman. She doesn't know what she's talking about. Detective Morrison held up a small recording device. We have your confession, Miss Collins. Your own words admitting to borrowing donations and discussing your strategic resource allocation. We also have financial records showing exactly where the missing money went. Frank moved to Ruth's side, putting a protective arm around his sister's shoulders. Are you okay, Ruthie? Ruth nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. I'm fine. I just can't believe someone could be so callous about hurting people who are already struggling. As Amanda was led away in handcuffs, still protesting her innocence, Detective Morrison turned to Ruth. You did the right thing, Mrs. Patterson. Without your courage in coming forward, this could have gone on for years. What happens now? Ruth asked. Now we recover as much of the stolen money as possible and make sure it gets to the families who should have received it in the first place. As for helping hands, the board of directors will need to find new leadership. Frank squeezed Ruth's shoulder. Maybe they should ask my sister to take over. She clearly knows how to run a charity the right way. In the weeks that followed, the full extent of Amanda's crimes became clear. She had stolen over $75,000 from the charity over a 3-year period, money that should have gone to rent assistance, food distribution, and emergency aid for hundreds of families. The luxury car lease, expensive clothes, and high-end apartment Amanda had been flaunting were all funded by donations meant for the community's most vulnerable residents. Amanda pled guilty to multiple felony charges and was sentenced to 4 years in prison, along with restitution payments that would take her years to complete. The local media coverage of her crimes sparked outrage in the community and led to increased oversight of charitable organizations throughout the region. But for Ruth, the most meaningful outcome came when the Helping Hands Board of Directors asked her to serve as the charity's new volunteer coordinator. At first, she was hesitant. The betrayal had shaken her confidence in her own judgment. "I should have seen it sooner," she confided to Frank as they walked through the charity's renovated space. All those families who needed help while she was stealing from them. "Ruth, you did see it," Frank replied firmly. "You saw it, you investigated it, and you stopped it. How many more families would have been cheated if you hadn't spoken up?" Ruth accepted the position, and under her leadership, Helping Hands began to rebuild its reputation and expand its services. She implemented new financial oversight procedures, established clear documentation requirements, and most importantly, made sure that every dollar donated actually reached the families it was intended to help. 6 months after Amanda's arrest, Ruth stood in the charity's main room during their Easter food distribution event. Families lined up orderly, volunteers worked efficiently to pack food boxes, and children played happily in the corner while their parents received assistance. Mrs. Rodriguez approached Ruth with tears in her eyes. "Miss Ruth, I want to thank you. Because of your help, my family, we don't lose our home. You saved us." Ruth hugged the grateful woman, feeling the warmth of knowing that their work was making a real difference. "We're all here to help each other, Mrs. Rodriguez. That's what community means." Frank, who had become a regular volunteer himself, watched his sister with pride. Ruth had not only exposed Amanda's crimes, but had transformed the aftermath into something positive and lasting. The shy, lonely widow who had started volunteering months earlier had discovered a strength and purpose she hadn't known she possessed. As the afternoon wound down and the last families received their assistance, Ruth looked around the bustling charity office with satisfaction. The walls were covered with new thank you letters. Genuine ones this time, from families whose lives had been touched by the organization's work. "Good day today," Frank said, joining Ruth as she locked up the office. "Every day is a good day when we can help someone," Ruth replied. "I just wish it hadn't taken me so long to learn that some people don't share that feeling." "But you learned it when it mattered most," Frank said. "And because you had the courage to act on what you learned, dozens of families are going to have better lives." As they walked home together in the evening light, Ruth reflected on how much her life had changed. The quiet retirement she had planned had been replaced by something far more meaningful, a sense of purpose that came from protecting the vulnerable and standing up for what was right. She thought about Amanda, serving her prison sentence and facing the consequences of her choices. Ruth felt no satisfaction in Amanda's downfall, only sadness for the opportunities wasted and the trust betrayed. But she also felt hope. Hope that the community could heal, that families in need would continue to receive help, and that the generosity of good people would always overcome the greed of those who would exploit it. "Frank?" Ruth said as they reached her front door. "Yeah, Ruthie? Thank you for believing in me, for helping me do the right thing even when it was scary." Frank smiled at his sister with deep affection. "That's what family is for. Besides, you didn't need my help to be brave, you just needed someone to remind you that you already were." As Ruth settled into her favorite chair that evening, surrounded by the photos of her life with George and her children, she felt a contentment she hadn't experienced since before her husband's death. She had found her place in the world again, not as someone who simply filled time with volunteer work, but as someone who could make a real difference in other people's lives. The phone rang, interrupting her peaceful reflection. It was Janet, one of the longtime volunteers at Helping Hands. "Ruth, I just wanted to thank you again for everything you've done. I know it wasn't easy to speak up against Amanda, but you saved this organization. You saved our ability to help families in this community. We all played a part, Janet. That's how these things work, when people come together and do what's right." After she hung up, Ruth smiled to herself. Tomorrow was Thursday, which meant another day of volunteering at Helping Hands. Another day of helping families, organizing donations, and making sure that every dollar contributed actually reached someone in need. She had learned that retirement didn't have to mean withdrawal from the world. Sometimes it meant finding a new way to contribute, a new way to matter. And sometimes, when the situation demanded it, it meant finding the courage to fight for what was right, no matter how frightening or difficult that fight might be. As she prepared for bed, Ruth felt grateful for the path that had led her to this moment. The betrayal and deception had been painful, but it had also revealed strengths she hadn't known she possessed and had ultimately led to something positive and lasting. The families who would benefit from Helping Hands services in the years to come would never know Amanda's name or the crimes she had committed. But they would benefit from the stronger, more transparent, and more effective organization that had emerged from the scandal. They would benefit from Ruth's determination to ensure that their trust was never betrayed again. And that, Ruth thought as she turned off the light, was the best possible outcome from a very difficult situation. Justice had been served, wrongs had been made right, and the work of helping others could continue, stronger and more meaningful than ever before. Thank you for listening until the end. If you enjoyed the story, please consider leaving us a like. This helps us reach more people.